Okay, so I'm back again, hello again, and you've got 20 more minutes of me in the slow part of the afternoon, so I'll try to keep this lively. And I'm going to be talking today about digital trade, an engine for global trade and growth. And how, of course, there's lots of work out there showing that digital trade does contribute and boost global trade. The thing I'm going to start by talking about is sort of the challenges that we have to measuring global trade. And figuring out just how much of it is going on out there. And then once I've set up the challenges, I'm going to turn it over and talk about the benefits. A lot of the benefits come from reducing trade costs, the cost of shipping goods and allowing new services to travel around the world. And so I'm going to, after that, transition to talking about trade costs and how much digital trade, the costs are still there, how much those trade costs can be reduced, and finish up a little bit, if there's time, talking about what trade policy or trade agreements can do to reduce those costs. Okay, and as I said a moment ago, we're going to start off with the challenges. And this rather ungainly picture talks about the various ways that digital trade is measured. And there's a sort of inherent tension between the types of measures out there that try to be inclusive, such as just the general generic cross-border digital trade, and how that you want to think about that is any good or service that is either purchased or ordered or delivered online. And that, of course, is going to include all of e-commerce, which is the business to business and then the business to consumers. So digital trade includes anything that you order online, anything that a company gets business to business through a digital service, or anything that's delivered digitally, like a service, like a professional service that's delivered over the internet. So all that's part of digital trade. Now there's this tension between this nice definition, broad definition, and what you can actually measure. And so what's done for measuring digital trade in many, many cases is to think about what is trade within specific industries. So those industries might be digitally intense industries, those industries might be data intensive industries, those might be IT industries, and then looking at those industries and thinking about how much trade is in those. Now, that, of course, has a challenge or a problem because some of that trade won't be digital trade, and that, of course, won't capture everything that's in the entirety of digital trade. So here's some of the challenges, a little bit more information. I already talked about some of them. I'll be talking a little bit later about a survey that the ITC did a couple years ago to try to figure out how much digital trade was going on in the United States. And then the surveys themselves present problems. Again, you're going to have to select the sectors that you're interested in surveying. A lot of surveys, including those in the United States, tend to focus on larger companies, and the smaller companies, you might not have any information about how they provide digital services or use them. And then lastly, surveys are sometimes special purpose or one-off, and so if you want to see a snapshot over time, you may not be able to do that. And I'm highlighting that because the US ITC survey was also a one-off single survey, so that's quite common. All right, how much digital trade is out there? As I said, it's a little hard to measure, but there's lots of it. According to UNCTAD last year, over 1 billion people made a purchase online in 2013. And then if you see how much the value was, there was 1.2 trillion of business-to-consumer cross-border and domestic e-commerce. So on average, those people who are making purchases online are spending about $1,000 a year on them. That's pretty substantial. But those numbers are dwarfed by the amount of business-to-business cross-border digital trade and domestic digital trade, which is $15 trillion, so a very substantial sum. How much is digital trade? So there have been some existing estimates out there. In our first report, the U.S. International Trade Commission had 2 reports on digital trade. They both came out in 2013 or 3 years ago. And the standard measure is just to add up the trade in digitally intensive sectors. And if you do that, then you'll find that there was $357 billion of digitally deliverable services exports that left the United States in 2011. The ITC was asked by Congress to see if we couldn't get a better answer to that question as to how much digital trade was there. And so we did a survey in 7 industries of 10,000 US companies. So pretty extensive survey. Getting a good answer to these things is expensive. Took several person years to run this survey. We looked again in 7 industries we thought would have the bulk of digital trade. content, digital communications, finance, manufacturing, trade, both retail trade and wholesale trade, and some other services. We sent this to 10,000 US firms, stratified random sampling, so these things are representative answers for the US and for US industries. What did we find in that survey? We found a lot of online sales in the United States, about $1 trillion worth, excuse me. Most of that, about a third of that, is delivered online, and 2/3 of it is delivered physically, and those physical deliveries are largely through manufacturing and retail. And if you look at, and also if you want to think of what size of the firms that are engaging in digital trade, domestically, or total anyway, about a quarter of them are SMEs. So small firms make up about a quarter of the value. And if you look at exports, more of that is delivered online, which makes sense because if you're sending something abroad, it's cheaper to do it online than physically. But still, a large portion of it, 60%, is physically delivered. And then, consistent with a lot of trade literature, the smaller firms are less engaged in exporting behavior. So I started out by saying that there's some challenges to measuring how much digital trade is going on. One, and that a lot of surveys are one-off, so you can't look at them over time. It may be easier to measure the amount of data that crosses border to give you a sense of how much data is increasing over time, and that might give you a sense, at least, to how much digital trade is going on. And you can see these pictures. This comes from McKinsey, that internet population grew by 144% in the 7-year period they were looking at. And that's pretty big growth, but then even more substantial is the use per person of the internet, which, if you can read it, is 665% increase in this period. And so those two things combined lead to a 17-time increase in the growth of cross-border internet traffic. So very, very substantial. Now, data flows are not exactly correlated with cross-border digital trade, but they're an indication that this stuff can be increasing very rapidly. Okay, so now that I've talked about the challenges, I want to transition to talking about a lot of literature that really shows how the internet and how digital trade contribute to trade and growth. Okay, and there's a fair bit of work out there that talks about the ways that the digital trade contributes to growth. And I've summarized those into 4 channels. The first 2 are productivity and innovation. And to simplify quite a bit, innovation says that you can do new things. You can deliver new services online that you couldn't deliver before. Productivity says you are doing the same things but more efficiently, and a lot of research shows that that's actually due to better communication. Another ways that digital trade benefits the global economy is by reducing trade costs. You drop costs pretty substantially by being able to deliver things or order things online. And then you also reduce the fixed cost of accessing new markets. So that means that smaller firms are now able to access overseas markets in ways they couldn't before. And then larger firms have access to more markets than they would have otherwise had. Okay, so getting back to the work at the US ITC, we wanted to know how much the internet was contributing to economic growth. And again, we asked 7 industries. Firms in 7 industries, and they said that where their work, when their workers weren't looking at cat pictures on the internet, they were actually the internet was raising productivity, and it was raising it by 8 to 11%, depending how you measured it. And again, this is highlighting both the fact that business to business is very important and that communications are improved. So if you plug in how much those productivity improvements would increase wages or increase GDP, you get pretty substantial effects. It says that the internet would have raised US GDP by around 4%, raised US wages by about 4%. And again, that's only the productivity in those 7 industries. So if you looked across more industries, you'd certainly find more substantial increases in wages and GDP. All right, there's quite a large body of evidence out there now about how internet reduces the costs of exporting, and because it reduces the cost of exporting, it then boosts international trade. And I've got 3 examples here. Guess that's big enough to read, good. And so looking at what the ITC found, we found that the internet reduces the cost of exporting and importing by 26%, which is really substantial amount. You imagine that tariffs on average around the world are 5%. So eliminating, this is a 5 times bigger reduction in costs than by eliminating tariffs globally. Also, once you've, as I mentioned, there's not only evidence that it reduces costs, but that it boosts growth. I've cited 2 things here. The first is Osnego and Tan, and they show that if an exporter increases its internet use, then it's going to increase the number of goods that it exports. So, and that if an importer increases its internet use, it continues to import more goods of the type it's already been importing. So, again, exporters that get more internet use access, new goods get sent abroad, and many of those could very well be smaller firms accessing foreign markets. And then if you look at work by David Riker, he has a similar message, a little bit of a twist, that says increasing internet adoption leads to a higher probability of exporting products, but that is dependent on sort of your infrastructure. And if you have good infrastructure, if you have efficient export logistics, then you get a bigger boost of the internet than otherwise. Internet adoption is going to differ by income and firm size. And here's some information based on World Bank enterprise surveys. And if you look, this is a small, medium, and large firms in each of the low income, the lower middle income, and the upper middle income countries. And the first thing I want to point out is that upper middle income and lower middle income look pretty similar in their internet use, but that they both have a lot more internet use currently than lower income countries. And that's going to affect the results you see on the next page. When we look at some research that says how much has internet use raised trade. And if you look, David Riker's got a paper that says if you look at broadband use increases that have actually occurred between 2000 and 2011, then high-income countries have benefited a lot more than developing economies. All right, but then again, what we just saw on the previous page is that the higher income have used the internet a lot more than the lower income. And it also, there's some other similar work by Myers 2 years ago that says that if you increased internet additionally, how much would you benefit? And there we see that developing economies would benefit more, and that's consistent with the fact that they have a lot more ways to go in increasing internet use. Okay, so if the internet and digital trade have lowered barriers, and that's boosted trade, how much more trade could we get if we lowered the barriers further? And how would we go about lowering barriers? And just what are those barriers? And that's what I'm going to talk about for the remaining part of this talk. Okay, so this is coming out of the ITC's, one of our 2 reports in 2013, where we categorize the types of barriers out there to digital trade. And this list, given what we've heard already today, things that Simon has said, and it probably comes as no surprise to the people in the room, most of these. Localization requirements are a barrier to digital trade, particularly the requirement to localize data servers. Market access limitations, such as restrictions on the type or amount of investment. Data privacy regulations on how private data move across borders. IP, intellectual property infringement. Uncertain legal liabilities, particularly whether internet intermediaries are going to be responsible for the things posted on their platforms, censorship, and the last one there, it may be a little surprising, customs measures. But remember, a lot of digital trade is actually physical products that are delivered in person and ordered online. And so anything that affects borders or customs is going to affect digital trade as well. So here's what we talk, just focusing in on one of those barriers, localization requirements. This is coming out of the ITC survey, and if you can read it, I hope you can. Down on that left-hand picture, that's the results for large firms and small firms in the 7 industries that the ITC surveyed. And you can see 2 things. One is that digital communications and content providers, media providers, are most affected by localization requirements. And also, sort of across the board, larger firms are more affected than smaller firms. And that might initially be surprising. After all, larger firms have the financial resources to deal with localization requirements, to set up multiple centers if need be. But it also reflects the fact, and you see this in lots of surveys, that bigger firms are more aware of the barriers they face abroad. If you're not actually exporting, you don't necessarily know what barriers are out there and how much you're affected. So you'll often find that bigger firms on surveys report being more affected by barriers, even when it might be logical to think that smaller firms are more affected. And then looking here specifically on removing the barriers to foreign trade, and these are specific to the larger firms, which again are the ones that are more informed about these things. What would we see? So if you look at the colors, the purple is the firms reporting that removing barriers would have the largest effect, and then blue is a slightly smaller effect, and green is a fairly small effect, and then that kind of hideous yellow color is no effect at all. And if you see, so some of the sectors, finance and manufacturing, you'll see that those firms claim that very little would change if you removed digital trade barriers. But in some sectors, particularly content, digital communications, what else? Retail and wholesale trade, they're reporting that they actually would have a fairly substantial improvement in their sales, and they would have a somewhat of a larger increase in employment of about 1%, a little less than 1%. And then that increase in employment and the increase in sales would also boost economic output. Here's some report, again, from our survey that say where the trade barriers are throughout Asia. There were about 50 countries in our survey, but I just selected the ones in Asia. And I don't want to focus on which country is more than another country, but to point out that U.S. firms report receiving a substantial portion of U.S. firms report barriers in basically every country. So that ranges from about 17% to over 40%. So the barriers are still out there. Okay, what can a trade agreement do to address these barriers? Well, I was just in the TPP panel, so I've stolen a couple slides from my other presentation, and just going to look at them here. What exactly would TPP do to reduce barriers in digital trade? Well, we see some of the same exact things we saw before repeated here. So TPP would ensure cross-border data and information flows. It prohibits forced localization. And then some of its other key provisions have to do with customs duties or customs forms, custom signatures, again, which we saw on the earlier page as barriers to digital trade. And then there's a few other ones that we didn't see before. So TPP addresses some of the older concerns and some new ones. Skip that. Okay, services trade. Services trade barriers are pretty substantial out there. Again, look at banking and other financial services. We estimate that the ad valorem equivalent of barriers in that sector, and this isn't barriers just to digital, but it's all barriers, is over 50%. That's much, much higher than most tariff rates. And we also estimate that, and those magnitudes are coming from some work we've done with CEPI, who have earlier measured non-tariff measure barriers. So working with CEPI, we got the extent, the blue bars there, and then working internally, we estimated how much TPP would reduce those or could reduce those barriers. And you'll see some pretty substantial reductions in the yellow triangles, or yellow diamonds, particularly in digital sectors like communications. And I just put a red bar around the sectors that are digitally intensive to give you a sense of what types of services are being addressed. All right, and as we saw earlier in my earlier slide, that the effect of TPP on the services sector is positive. It's not giant as a percentage. It's 0.1%, but it's pretty substantial money. It's $42 billion per year. And lastly, I just wanted to point out exports. Cross-border trade in services would increase pretty substantially. $5 billion total, but that masks some interesting differences. About $17 billion more increase to TPP countries, but then a diversion of about $12 billion away from the rest of the world. So pretty substantial trade flows, both increasing trade with TPP partners and reducing it elsewhere. All right, so that is what I've got to say about digital services. Thank you.